In the 7th century, the most widespread, highest ideal of piety was asceticism. And what did asceticism entail? Asceticism entailed leaving behind your household, actually creating a new single-sex household within monasteries. It entailed giving up all of your wealth and potentially even being a mendicant. And what the Qur'an is proposing and what the Prophet comes along as is a very different vision of a holy man. He's a holy man within a household.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Riyadh, as always, and my co-host this time is Mohammed Bushra, our managing editor at Muftah. Our guests for this episode are Karen Bauer and Feras Hamza. They're the co-authors of a new book titled Women, Households, and the Hereafter in the Qur'an, a Patronage of Piety, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2024. Professor Bauer is a research associate at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. She received her PhD from Princeton in 2008, and her research focuses mostly on the Qur'an and its interpretation. Professor Hamza heads the School of the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Wollongong in Dubai. He received his PhD from Oxford in 2001, and he is also a research fellow at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Now, this isn't the sort of work or genre of scholarship that would ordinarily grab my attention, but I learned about it a few months ago and I read it carefully for a book review I was working on, and I realized it actually touches on some interesting and important issues at the intersections of religious and gender studies. So, naturally, I thought I'd invite the authors on the show to discuss their argument and its implications, and they kindly agreed. In a word, the book explores the social and moral significance of women as a narrative development in the Qur'an, especially as it relates to what the authors say the main plot of the text is: salvation. You'll hear them elaborate on their arguments in the book in just a moment, but before that, I want to say a quick thank you to our supporters on Substack and Patreon for helping make this episode possible, and I invite listeners of the show to consider joining our community on Substack at muftah.org, or on Patreon at patreon.org/proteanview, which you can do for as low as $5 a month. Whether it's on Substack or on Patreon, your monthly contribution gets you a number of benefits. For example, our Patreon supporters can get a custom coffee mug, and I just recently sent out a couple of those. And subscribers to our magazine get full access to our archive, among other things. If you're looking to get more involved with the podcast and have a greater say in our direction, I think Patreon is the place for that. With your paid support there, you can get exclusive behind-the-scenes content, early access to episodes, an invitation to our Discord server, and even an ability to select our next guest on the show and what questions we ask them. So if that sounds good to you, visit us at patreon.com/proteanview. You can also visit us at muftah.org and subscribe there. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to stay updated on the latest from us. Thanks for listening and for your support. And here now is our conversation with Karen Bauer and Feras Hamza. Karen and Feras, thank you for joining us. We're very happy to talk to you about your new book, Women, Households, and the Hereafter in the Qur'an, a Patronage of Piety. Why don't you start us off by telling us, either of you or both of you, what the main argument of the book is, and what are some of the key themes in that book?
Lovely big question to start with. I suppose the main argument of the book has to be that there is a very important moral plot in the Qur'an for moral transformation, and women figure in it as much as men, in the shortest possible way, I can say that. So the moral trajectory is at the heart of the Qur'an's kind of what is technically called the kerygma, the mission statement, if you like. And that moral transformation is told, the possibilities of that moral transformation are told in different ways from the earliest period all the way till the end, from the Meccan period all the way to the Medinan period. And if you follow that moral plot, you will see that women actually increase in their significance, in their presence as in that story throughout the Qur'an. And the way that you'd know that they're increasing is because one of the things that we did is that we arranged the verses of the Quran that had to do with women or the female or the feminine in a kind of chronological order. So we kind of unpacked it all, put it all in a chronology. We saw that women were an increasingly present subject in the Quran, and they only gain in importance by the time you're in Medina. So I guess in sum, we wanted to tackle something different about women. Initially, actually, of course, the birth of this came from a previous work which we had worked on, which is called the Anthology of Quranic Commentaries. There's been 2 volumes now. The first one was on a different topic called The Nature of the Divine. Volume 2 was on women themselves. And of course, as you probably both might know, the material on women is sui generis in the tafsir tradition. It is generated very much with a jurisprudential mindset that is male-dominated historically. Reading the Quran in contemporary times with the history of the enfranchisement, I suppose, of women, political and otherwise, and the emancipation of women, it's very difficult to try and get anywhere from the tafsir tradition. And so the tafsir tradition tends to be very conservative and kind of its times, at a time when women were not involved in either the dialogue or the discourse about what affects them in the Quran, because it's talking to them as much as it's talking to men. And so having been disappointed thoroughly with the material in the tafsir tradition, and of course with one eye to contemporary women's concerns, I mean, whether Muslim feminists or otherwise, we had to do something about it. We felt that the Quran was saying much more about the topic of women, but that was not in tafsir. So those are kind of 2 points of genesis for the project.
Tell us a little about how you approach the woman as a subject of inquiry, as a subject of study. You had said in the beginning of your comments there that you situate the woman as part of a broader salvation story. So maybe if you could just comment on that and tell us whether in the book the woman is a subject of inquiry that can be detached, studied in isolation from that broader salvation story, or is she very much implicated in that salvation story in a way where she cannot be removed from it?
I really like this question, and I think it really cuts to the heart of what we were saying in the book and what we actually, in my case, what I discovered by doing the research for the book, which is that really women cannot be detached from the major flow of the Quran or the major messages of the Quran or what we would call the salvific plot of the Quran. So you asked earlier about the main message of our book, and there are other aspects to it as well. One of them is that there is really in the Quran, it's really crucial to recognize that there is no separation between what we would call the sacred realm and the profane realm. This is a kind of artificial separation that has been imposed by scholars of religion in the modern times. I mean, of course, something similar goes back in medieval Islamic thought with the idea of the deen and the dunya, the religious aspects and the worldly aspects. But actually, in the Quran, what we find is that there's a really thorough integration of everything that goes on in a person's daily life is actually attached to their own personal salvific narrative, whether they're those actions of theirs, no matter what kind of action, interaction, or transaction it is, if it's, say, prayer or fasting, or if it's their interactions with somebody in the street or their interactions within the household, all of that is judged on a moral basis. And this is why the fact is that in the field of Quranic studies, there had been a tendency to separate out women as a subject of inquiry as though it were not attached to the larger theological messages of the Quran. And what we really discovered is that that's a major mistake, because then you actually miss what's really going on. It's so common in introductions to the Quran to read the list of things that are mentioned in the Quran, a list of subjects, right? And of course, it's natural for us as academics to write that way and to want to do a list of subjects and to want to make it into a list. What Feras and I are proposing is that there's one major subject in the Quran, and that is salvation or damnation. That's the afterlife. That's whether you get to what your eventual end is. And that every single thing in it revolves around that major subject. So if you have verses on divorce, they're not separate morally in terms of the moral actions, how one would conduct oneself in divorce from, say, verses on like prayer or fasting, right? It's the similar language is used to describe conduct in both of those realms. And there was another major point that we make, which is that in order to understand what's going on in the Quran as a whole, it's really crucial to understand as much as we can about its social milieu. And that's where households and patronage come in. And there again, we see the tendency is to think about the Quran as there would be religious subjects and then there would be profane subjects, the communal subjects, or the subjects dedicated to God. And we don't really see that when we look at the actual social context of the Quran. And I don't know if Firas wants to talk about how that works. I'd say that what we noticed is that linguistically, what you see is a key connection with the ideas that had gone back to ancient times of patronage in households. And this is absolutely central to putting the Quran to putting the moral messages of the Quran into their context and to understand, therefore to understanding those moral messages.
When you say that the woman cannot be read outside of that salvific plot of the Quran, as you put it, you're not at the same time suggesting that the woman is devoid of agency, is just a, what would you call it, a bit player in a larger story that she has no agency in or no role. You're saying the opposite, that she has a role to play, she has a sense of agency, but nonetheless, that has to all be read in the context of a broader salvation story. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I would like to think that when the Quran says, Ya ayyuhal insan, women and men are included in that call. And so, insofar,
And that, just to interject, Ya ayyuhal insan translates to,
oh, a human being, not very elegant, but there you go. Perhaps I shouldn't have started by talking about the moral journey because that the possibilities of moral transformation is really what the Quran is trying to get across. It just tells a story situated in the 7th century according to, the time and place. And so, of course, one of the things that readers of the Quran will always say, well, look at the rules against, I don't know, the rules for marriage or rules for divorce or the power of men over women and so on. And all of these tend to be kind of, I would say, misreadings of what the Quran is doing. And they're used, of course, as evidence that the fact that the Quran somehow thinks that women are second grade. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think the Quran is a very realist text, and it was telling a story about the 7th century society and approaching its plot for moral transformation through that lens. So if it had been revealed in the 20th century or the 21st century, it would have told the story according to what it found, the characters and the kind of positionality of people right now in the here and now. It just happens to be that the story is told in the 7th century when women were perhaps within social structures, within certain roles, right? Be they, wealthy patrons or oppressed, part of the kind of oppressed or an extension of the household. And so you have to follow the kind of the logic of the Quranic plot to be able to understand the role of women in that. But I think to answer your question very simply, if the question was about the role of women, I mean, it's not something, I don't want to instrumentalize it. It's fundamental. I mean, it's insofar as human beings are either men or women.
So I think that one of the major arguments that we make is that every single human being in the Quran has equal moral agency, no matter what their social roles are. And so women are actually presented in the Quran as the prime example of this, although it also applies to rich and poor and free and enslaved people, as others have pointed out that there's a kind of emancipatory message in the Quran with regard to social class. But it's not only that women are not devoid of agency, but that they are prime examples of how every single person, no matter what their social status, has absolute moral agency and is able to undertake whatever actions they need to take in order to gain salvation at the end of the day, or at the end of life, I guess, in this case. And I think another thing that's important to point out is that I think contrary to a lot of modern readings, I don't think that Firas and I would argue that the Quran is actually prescribing particular social roles for men and women, or that, in fact, given that we can infer that there probably were very potentially even quite strict social roles, it doesn't actually say much about that. There's an implication a lot of times that households are organized in a certain way, but we also see that women's moral agency gets them social agency. And what I mean by moral agency and social agency is social agency is the thing that we're used to thinking of as agency. It's how can you act in society? Do you have the freedom of expression or the ability to go out of the house or all that stuff? Moral agency is your ability to understand morality and to make moral choices in any moment in your life. And so when we say that women's moral agency, which is absolute, and as is every human being, and according to the Quran, gives them a certain amount of social agency, what I'm referring to are things like in Surat al-Mumtahana, which is called She Who Will Be Tested. There are verses that describe if a man is married to an unbelieving woman, he should just let her go. And if a believing woman is married to an unbelieving man, she can come over to the believers. And now this is pretty major. In a text that's always been read to institutionalize men's power over marriage and divorce and his power to, for instance, in medieval fiqh, there were schools of law that said that men had the right never to let their wives out of the house. In the Quran itself, that's simply not what we see happening. We do not see that. What we see is that actually women had freedom of movement and even freedom to leave their husbands if they wanted to. And then at that point, once they've left and joined the believing community, it becomes an interaction between the men of the believers and the unbelievers. How much dowry did you pay? Okay, we'll pay you back. That kind of, it becomes a financial transaction because, of course, all of these things, we're used to thinking of marriage as something between a man and a woman. This is not how it worked in 7th century Arabia. This was an alliance of families. These were all the relatives were involved, the households are involved, and the whole communities are involved in these alliances. And so it's a really different way of considering what it means to be a person in society when you think of yourself and say who you marry, not really just in terms of an individual choice, but in terms of your entire family and social kind of standing.
Both of you talk about the woman in different registers in the Quran as wives, as mothers, as daughters, and so on. Paint a picture for us about who the woman is as an addressed subject of the Quran, and maybe tell us a little bit about how you perceive the way the woman is addressed in the Quran as laying the groundwork for broader moral lessons that are not necessarily restricted to women.
So I'll start with the second part, Riyadh. I think for me, the striking examples are the narrative sections of the Quran that tend to be kind of middle to late Mecca period. So right in the middle of the Quran, probably from chapters, I would say, 11 onwards. There you begin to find the stories of exemplars. Of course, Mary is the most often cited and the most obvious example because that's, she's common to the other religious traditions. But I think also overlooked are other characters in the Quran who are kind of highlighted at once to be shown up for their moral deficiency, but at the same time become redeemed, and they become a model of redemption for all. I mean, male or female readers. The best example of that, of course, is the officer's wife, as she's referred to in the Quran. Context is Pharaoh in Egypt, and Joseph is kind of in the house of his master, and the wife of the master, of course, tries to seduce him, and she's shown up as consumed by her desires, worldly, carnal desires, and she's after him throughout the narrative, right? But then comes a moment when I think she at once realizes that this was the path of what is called wronging the self, right? Self wronging, because you're doing all of the morally bankrupt, the morally wrong actions that are just pave the way for damnation. But she has a moment of kind of, I suppose, guidance or enlightenment, where she confesses, admits her erroneous way, and is redeemed in effect. And that's an exemplary story. Another one that I find very striking is, of course, because this one comes from a position of power, which is also interesting. The ruler of the land of Sheba, of course, is known as the Queen of Sheba in kind of extra Quranic literature. She's, of course, she rules over a land. She has armies. She has male advisors, as far as we can tell, and she's asked to come and submit, which actually shows up Solomon in a very bad light in some sense, because he's being he's being a bit thuggish about it. Like, how can there be still a kingdom that does not submit to me? And I think she takes it very well. She takes it with a kind of sense of, she takes it slowly. That's the sense that you get from reading the Quranic story. She consults her advisors. She reminds them that, when such kind of kings enter lands, they kind of wreak destruction and cause havoc. So you get that sense of, it's an interesting way in which power is portrayed through the female subject. And yet, she's, of course, also on a path of error, because she worships the sun, and it's only when she is with Solomon and then she sees this whole ruse of her arsh, or her throne, being kind of, whatever it is, teleported to Jerusalem, does she then realize that she'd been erring, and that she'd mistaken the things of this world, in fact, for her God. And in some sense, of course, that is an exemplary story told from a different angle. But there's, of course, Mary, and there are others. Karen might have a favorite, so I'll defer to her.
Yeah, and then one of the important things to point out about those stories, is that the language that is used to describe the women on their trajectory is the same language that's used to describe male characters on their trajectories. When Abraham was worshiping the wrong things, and he realizes it's the language and it's the stories that echo each other. So Queen of Sheba's story echoes Abraham's story in that he was also worshiping the wrong things, and then he came to realize that he wanted to worship God, the creator of all of those things. And when she says, "I have wronged myself," those very words are spoken by Moses in a completely different context when he kills a man, and then he realizes that doing wrong to someone else is actually wronging himself. And so one of the key points to realize about the stories that have to do with women, is that to take women as the sole lens through which you look at those stories is to mistake the moral point of the stories. The moral point of the stories is that whether you are Moses or whether you are the Queen of Sheba, you can err and you can repent, and then there's that possibility of repentance and forgiveness for that. And the moral trajectory of these stories is just echoed linguistically again and again and again. I mean, others have noticed that the story in Surah Maryam, that the story of Zachariah, the prophet, echoes Mary's story as well, with Jesus a lot in linguistic ways as well. And you just have this over and over, where actually and this gets to your actual question, Riyadh, which is, what is the woman in the Quran? And I think, in a very fundamental sense, the woman and the man are ultimately not the most important categories in the Quran. The important categories are whether somebody is a believer and is righteous and doing righteous works, or if somebody is an unbeliever and doing unrighteous works. Those are the key categories, not male or female. Those ultimately do not matter in the least for somebody's moral trajectory.
So I guess what Karen's speaking about is the importance of the nafs, which is the word for soul or the self in the Quran. And actually when you end up realizing that that's the main point of all of these stories, you kind of get beyond this gender debate, which is really important. And, it kind of makes you think, well, so a lot of it is ungendered. It's not really about these genders. It's about fundamentally the soul, and that's what's of value. And so you, as an individual, of course, you are responsible for this soul. And little wonder that Quran says, that in scenes of the resurrection, of course, you have these descriptions of souls who have lost themselves. They can, they've lost themselves. It's as if you were a guardian of your soul and then you just lost it. You forsook it because you didn't take care of it, and now it's damned. So we are in this relationship of caretaker, of guardianship of our own souls, and we have to do something about that. And in that sense, it doesn't matter whether you're a man or woman.
Yeah, I was surprised when I was reading the book because I had come into it thinking that this was going to be an exploration of gender as such. But as you just put it, Firas, what we as readers come out with is the sense that, in fact, the woman as a narrative development in the Qur'an has a lot more to do with piety in a sort of gender neutral sense. And so you sort of examine and you explore that narrative development, which I think is very unique and a very interesting way to pursue a study of the woman as a narrative subject.
Great discussion so far. I had a couple of questions really to do with kind of topics and themes. One thing that comes clearly throughout the book is this idea of the salvific plot of the Quran. And the picture that's painted is that, not enough scholars pay attention to this concept of the afterlife as not one theme among many or one subject among many, but rather the structuring force for all Quranic material, quotidian, sublime, and so on. So my first question is, why are we interested in this notion of plot, and why the afterlife specifically? So why plot, not theme first, and then why the afterlife specifically and not, for example, the monotheistic ideal, oneness of God? That's the central structuring theme of the Quran, for example. Because obviously there's different ways that we could take it, but I'm just curious as to why this specific framing, salvation and the afterlife specifically, is what you both see as the central structuring force.
Yeah, I'll start and hand over to Karen with this. I think the idea of plot comes from the pervasive sense in the Quranic narration, and not narrative, I'm just saying the whole narration of the Quran, that there are certain kinds of souls or nafs, typologies. And these typologies become typologies of plot that if you read the stories and you read the descriptions of the characters in the Quran, you'll see that people are either, damned, let's start with the worst, because they're on a path of error and they don't do anything about it. And then we're kind of fast forward or, flash forward to the resurrection, and they're there and they're kind of lamenting and they're saying, oh, if only we'd listened, or if only we'd, done this or that. So there's clearly a plot of damnation that one can kind of unfortunately put oneself on. But there's also other options. And I think, the second one I would say is the one of enduring because of hardship, the hardship that life generally is for the vast majority of human beings. Hardship in itself pays rewards. Endurance, understanding that endurance is also a moral test that accrues moral value and moral goodness for the person and reward. And so, it is virtuous, in other words, to endure the pain that you're tested with, the trials of life, and so on. It is not to dismiss them at all, but just to try and say that the Quran at least sees that there is value in them, and they're a deliberate part of God's test, if you like, the bala, the concept of test, bala, in the Quran. And finally, of course, the path of obedience. So for some individuals, obedience is the natural path, and they stay on it. They may err now and then, but in some sense, they are along the path. They're kind of firmly along the path. And it's interesting because the Arab lexicographers will tell you that tam'ana, the verb that gives you the sense of reassurance in Arabic, it actually refers to a paved or a kind of even road that you walk on. Isn't that interesting? And so the idea that there are three types of souls that appear in the Quran, this is not very, it's not any kind of, they only appear, I think, once each. But, I think scholars have picked up on them. And there's the idea that there's one soul which is always in error. and that's always commanding itself to follow its carnal desires and the things of this world to its detriment. And then there's another type of soul that is a soul that's repentant, right? This one's called a lawama, the one that constantly kind of, feels the guilt, there's a kind of the remorse. And so if you feel remorse, then you feel that something's wrong and then you do something about it. And then finally, of course, you find that nafs al-mutma'inna, the reassured souls, because it feels confident enough that the path of piety and obedience will get somewhere. And so that's why I think we emphasize a typology of plots, because there are these plots that pervade the Quranic narration, and you begin to put it all together, you can see them clearly.
And what plot is that's different from theme? Okay, we could use the word theme, and it's in a sense an inert word. But what a plot does is it entails movement and tension. Okay, and so what we wanted to convey by talking about the salvific plot in the Quran is that actually it's not just characters that are experiencing these plots in the Quran. It's anyone who is exposed to the Quran. In fact, from the Quranic perspective, every single person on earth is following one of these plots at any one time, and they could be following different plots at different points in their lives. And what the invitation is through stories like there will be the Adam and Eve story, and then in Surah Al-A'raf, the 7th surah, then there are addresses to the children of Adam, so directly to the audience, right? So the invitation is to understand that if you're listening to this, that you are actually on one of these trajectories. And so it's that there's movement and tension in the stories in the Quran, but it's that the person who is listening or reading the Quran is supposed to be able to apply that and understand that that can reflect a movement and tension in their own lives towards something. And that again comes back to why the afterlife, and not saying like that monotheism is the key theme of the Quran. Why would we say that it's the afterlife? And that's because, I mean, obviously, to get in the Quranic view, to get to the afterlife, you would need to be a monotheist, right? There's no separating those things. It's not that you can get there through polytheism. But I think that this notion of worshiping something other than God is much wider than people usually would give it credit for. I mean, there is the notion in the Quran that people can follow their own desires as a god, right? That's one of the verses. And so that's, again, this idea that people are following their own inclinations and they're on this path of error rather than following the guidance and then being on the path of kind of righteous conduct. And so why we would say that the afterlife would be the central theme, and I don't know if Firas wants to jump in here or maybe even correct what I'm saying, but is because monotheism, again, is a kind of yes or no, whereas the afterlife is a trajectory. You move towards it. It's something that is an end goal that you're moving towards at every point.
I think just to put both of Karen's answers together, and I think it's a good question, Muhammad. I value the question. I begin to see how actually having asked it, you've kind of can answer yourself in a fuller way. I think the idea that it's plot is because plot also explains all the inexplicables that happen along the way. I mean, plot gives a sense to everything that otherwise wouldn't be seen, much like, when you start watching a movie, you don't know what's what, who's what, when is this scene shot, when flash forward, but only when you see all the bits together do you then make sense. So I think plot allows you to make sense. On the issue of monotheism, I think I'd like to answer, in addition, in a much more broader historical thing. I think monotheism wasn't so radical in the 7th century, but I think the idea of an afterlife that made sense of monotheism is the really radical idea. And it's unfortunately not actually much appreciated as a historical reflection on the contribution of the Qur'an in the 7th century, that is really a radical idea. I mean, of course, nowadays with our contemporary sensibilities, it's kind of just dismissed as some kind of, just another kind of, nice thing that was once said or somebody promised, but nobody really takes it seriously. And I dare say even Muslims probably, I don't know. But it's such a radical idea that everything that you're doing in the here and now, as Karen was saying earlier, matters. And if it matters, this is the consequence. And so it's so weighty. It just explains and allows you to understand life in all of its kind of precariousness and all of its complexity. You can begin to give meaning to it. And I think that's a really radical way of thinking, regardless of what the promises of the afterlife are.
Exactly. And then that's where we get into the type of piety that the Quran promotes. And that, again, is also very socially situated. In the 7th century, the most widespread, highest ideal of piety was asceticism. And what did asceticism entail? Asceticism entailed leaving behind your household, actually creating a new single-sex household within monasteries, right? It entailed giving up all of your wealth and potentially even being a mendicant, like wandering around impoverished, letting other people support you, right? And what the Quran is proposing and what the Prophet comes along as is a very different vision of a holy man, right? He's a holy man within a household. And he's saying, actually, this is the highest good. The highest good is what you can do here at home within the bounds of the walls. And that's where the Quran says, for any audience of 2, God is the third person there. And that really means that actually you can feel that you're alone within the household, but that every little action there is also judged according to how well it's undertaken morally. And so essentially what we're talking about is that, well, everybody in the 7th century, or the monotheists of the 7th century, would have known that somebody who devoted themselves to God by removing themselves from daily life, that was the promise of asceticism, is that if you remove yourself from daily life, then you are holy. That is now replaced by something that can be actually practiced by everyone in their daily lives, right? In their own households.
Yeah, it's a text about, into the fray. I mean, it's all about being in the midst of the mess. And and ironically, in that sense, I just feel, in this, at the risk of sounding somehow apologetic, it's such a relevant text because it really tells you about being in the messiness of life and what to do about it. And that's a very kind of, as a practical philosophy, I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. And then that's where the patronage language comes in, because of course patronage was really, patronage societies are societies where, say, you have a patron and clients, and we all know examples of this, because although we don't have that formal language, we don't use that formal language anymore, we can see this happening around us in different societies, where you have somebody who has a lot of power, then they do favors for people who do not have a lot of power, and those people then owe that person allegiance, right? And so you get people doing favors for other people, and then people allying themselves and supporting that person. And what happens in these systems is that it tends to be it tends towards moral corruption, obviously. It tends towards, the flatterers will get a lot of power in such a system. And the Quran uses the exact language of patronage and says, and instructs the believers not to do that. It says, do not expect any recompense for the good that you do, except for from God. And God then becomes the patron of all the believers. And then people enact goodness in the world as a way of getting recompense from God, rather than as a way of gaining worldly power.
This is probably a perfect segue, actually, to the other question I had regarding the concept of households and patronage as an area of study. So, in the book, you justify the reason for having studied it. Number one, because it was severely understudied, which is obviously sufficient justification in and of itself. And then secondly, that it's a relevant site of inquiry for understanding the role of the woman, both in the Qur'an and kind of in early Muslim society in the 7th century. So I guess first, maybe could you unpack that a little bit, speak to that, and kind of why you made that choice with these justifications.
So, as Karen was saying, I think patronage was just the institution through which a lot of towns and villages, through which life was possible. Because if you have to forget that we live in straight state structures with instruments of government, and we're kind of dependent on so much technical institutionalism that it's very difficult to unthink all of that and think back to a time when you're dependent on one or two patrons for your life, actually, as much as we know from Roman times. I mean, the idea of the head of the family, the patron, had power over all of those in his household. And I think even in the earliest Greek, though I'm not an expert, but in some of the late Greek period, they even had power of death over the people in their household. And that's a state. I mean, that's what the modern state, if you read your political theory, I think, Muhammad, the state, you sign your life off to the state, and that has power over you. So the patron, so as a structure, patronage is really important to understand the pre-modern period, and especially the period that we're talking about. We try to see that as geographically, Arabia as an extension of the Near East. And so if we were to understand, and late antique studies have done that, if we were to understand patronage structures in the nearest geographical area, could we see that extended into Arabia? And lo and behold, the Qur'an is full of it. I mean, it was just it was a treasure trove, really, to make that link with late antique studies. So patronage is important to understanding that society. It's also actually a way of understanding that those individuals, because we are talking about piety, and piety was, as we said, in the midst of, in the fray itself, in the fray of life, so in the middle of all social relationships. A large part of being pious, or perhaps even impious, was located within the household. And so those relationships were important, and they were important both ways, right? From the point of view of the power of the patron, of the head of the family, and from the point of view of all those who were underneath that power, or his power. So I think it provided us with the kind of, if you like, the crucible within which we could show that Quranic piety, how Quranic piety worked.
Okay, so also we should mention potentially that we actually came to the whole patronage realization late in the game. It was that we were talking about the male together, about the male head of household, the paterfamilias. That came early, and we realized that the Quran is structured this way, and that it's assuming this social structure. I mean,
you see, Karen is giving you the plot, so I didn't want to give you the plot. Right.
Yeah, but yeah. So actually, then we were discussing that male head of household and how he acts as a patron. And one day Firas says to me, actually, the language of patronage is everywhere in the Quran. That's the key. And so it goes this is a first foray into patronage in the Quran, but it goes far beyond the role of women, or men. It's a real metaphor that I think deserves to be studied much more, actually. I mean, to just give you a little example, we went to Pompeii recently, and there patronage was in ancient Rome. So Pompeii got destroyed in, I think it was 79 AD. Okay, so there, patronage was well enshrined. The male head of household would sit and have an audience for his clients who would come, only they weren't seen in order of their, of like when they got there, as we would assume in a meritocracy. No, they were seen in order of their ranking with the patron, right? The patron had absolute power over everyone in the household. I think that in pagan law, Firas was referring to this. I believe that he could even kill his slaves with complete impunity, right? So it's a real change. And of course, before this came Judaism and Christianity saying, life is worth something no matter whose life it is. And so this does not emerge, the Quranic view does not by any means emerge in a vacuum. But it does emerge in a tribal society where there aren't state superstructures to oversee, where if you're a woman and you get divorced, you don't go off in some apartment, living alone. You go to your male relatives or your sons even potentially, right? And so it's really essential. It's not just to understand the role of women, but also of men. Why are men addressed in particular ways? Is to understand that there's no state there to address and say, actually, state, you should take these functions. It's actually all just the patrons, the tribal leaders who are, and that explains a lot about where today we might take it very personally. And I think a lot of people reading the Qur'an would assume, for instance, that, oh, if the Qur'an is addressing men about divorce, or if the Qur'an is addressing men about looking after women, then it's enshrining their social position. It's saying, men, you deserve this social position by basis of your gender or something. But what we would say, I think, is that actually within a patronage society, the Quran is giving women a lot of rights. So I don't know, Firas, you said something the other day. Well, if the Quran has come along to institute that it's really common. The common narrative. Do you remember saying this? The common narrative is that among Muslims is that the Quran came and gave women rights, right? Well, we agree, but
Yeah, we agree. But I think everybody always tells you, the first thing you ask a Muslim, they're very proud of it. They say, well, the Quran was a major revolution socially and it emancipated women. Great, wonderful. So then what happened? So for
yeah.
like a
So what are you
thousand,
doing about it now?
a thousand, 300 years of jurisprudence, we haven't really come very far. In the end, Muslim women's freedom came through the enfranchisement rights that, were born in a different historical experience, and they were kind of imported. So what we do there, I suppose, in that sense, the institutions actually of jurisprudence, I would argue, are actually sought to restrain a lot of the rights that were granted to women as human subjects. I mean, that's the point in the Quran. It's you as a human being. That's the worth. So again, we go back to that theme. But before I lose that track that was Karen's, I think it's important to understand that the patronage thing is actually an important way in which the Quran shows you, look, if the patrons can be good, if the most powerful, the wealthiest can be good, then everybody can be good. But if they're corrupt, that's the worst example. So they kind of exemplify both ends of the spectrum. But that's only because the point is being made about their piety, not about not about the fact that they're male subjects.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
And we know that because we see women who are supposed to be patrons, the Queen of Sheba and the officer's wife. The officer's wife is a patron of Joseph, and she then behaves corruptly. And then she has to undergo the moral transformation of recognizing. And then we see the prophets' wives singled out in the Quran and addressed directly and told, okay, well, you can stay. You can go your own way if you want to, or you can stay and you can obey God and the prophet. Everybody always cites this as some kind of example of the prophet's power as a husband, but not ignoring entirely the linguistic parallels with all believers. All believers are given that choice to stay or to go. All believers are given the choice to either stay and obey God and the prophet, or to go their own way and do their own thing. And so things that are often viewed in a gendered lens are in fact really ungendered in the moral message of the Quran, even the prophet's wives.
Absolutely. And just to add another example of an overlooked reading, in the remind me, Karen, surah that mentions the two wives of two prophets.
66. Sorry, Tahrim.
Okay, so chapter 66.
It's verse 10 to 12, I think, is the ones you're thinking of.
Yeah, and that's in our anthology. I should know for reference. Insofar as it's possible for two women to have chosen the path of damnation, and insofar as that indicates their freedom, I think even the stories of damnation tell you that it's not a gendered discussion. It's about the freedom of the individual to choose their path, and hence women have the right, insofar as they can also choose their right to be damned, they can also choose a path to salvation. So it's not, all of these examples sort of destabilize this otherwise very kind of gendered approach to the Quranic salvation language and the Quranic stories.
Yeah. So those verses, what they say is essentially it's giving examples for the unbelievers of the wives of Noah and Lot, that they were, and it uses this term, they were under our two righteous servants, okay, taht, under. And that means that they were in the household of a prophet, right? And these women chose to
Disobey,
Kha'in is what's
betray.
the betray. Yeah. They chose to betray the righteous servants, as the Quran calls them. And then it goes on to give the example of Mary and the wife of Pharaoh, who were women who again also acted independently of their households, and Mary went off away from her household to have Jesus, and the wife of Pharaoh, of course, her husband is the ultimate sinner, but she is saved despite that, right? And so this Surah At-Tahrim 66, the way that it ends, it's really a very powerful message. And the other thing that it says is that these women who are saved are examples for the believers. It's a gender neutral term. It doesn't say they're examples for the believing women. It doesn't gender it. They're examples for all believers. So these women can be examples for all believers. And it's something that can be missed if it's looked at through a solely gendered lens. Yeah.
And this is possibly one of the last periods of Quranic revelation. So this not like this is one of the last moments of the Quran. So, we are of the view that these series of chapters that come round about chapter perhaps 58, 60, 61, 66, they're kind of synopses of the longer Medinan surahs. So they possibly could have come as kind of quick snapshot reminders of major themes. So and in any case, this is a Medinan surah. So this is the last phase of the Quran. So whatever it's saying there is not kind of some early thing that was then overturned. So yeah.
I want to come back to something that I think it was you, Firas, who mentioned a moment ago about rights in the Quran and piety and women. I think you're touching on an interesting point of friction here with feminist and post-feminist scholars. I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on how you differ with them, not just on the issue of rights, the issue of egalitarianism, but also on the issue of piety. I know that in the final chapter of the book, you disagree a little bit, not necessarily disagree, but you point out a minor difference that you have with Saba Mahmood and her idea of piety. Maybe you could also talk about that.
Yeah, on Saba Mahmood, I think Saba actually's scholarship is very much, positioned in 20th and 21st century deliberations on the body. So it's not that, as we say in the book, I think that we take a lot from what she's done in terms of working on the body and the body as being a vehicle for explaining, I suppose, for anthropologists, explaining a lot of the meaning of ritual and what are these fuzzy concepts, to kind of a secular mind, such as piety and so on. How does it happen? How does it look to an anthropologist sitting there watching a bunch of believers doing certain things? How does it work that they then get into some kind of dynamic mode of energy, and then that this is repeated and it kind of does something for them on some kind of psychological or emotional level? I think that's all fine, but I think where we not differ, what we want to qualify, I think, Saba Mahmood's wonderful work is that when you read her work, you get the sense that if you do enough with the body, if you get the body to do these things in a kind of mechanical way, eventually it leads to some kind of pious animation. Like, she's not wrong in some sense, because all all ritual discipline is based on practice and repetition. I mean, we know that because there's things called dhikr, which is remembrance, which is repetition of formulae, of God's names, and so on. There's the repetition of the prayer every day, and there's a repetition of the fast whenever you can, at least once a year, and so on. So repetition and the practice of these exercises does cultivate in a kind of a piety. But I think where we would want to caution is it's not just an external act. There is a coordination between the inner disposition that's made up of a kind of psyche and a set of emotions, and a barometer that only you as an individual know about. That barometer is a barometer of how sincere is your commitment to that idea that whatever you're worshiping, a one God, and so on. And that emotional collocation or positioning or has to be coordinated with the physical acts, because ultimately, of course, that what if somebody does 1,000 prayers or genuflections? I mean, then they mean nothing. The idea is that we wouldn't want to separate the body as a site of pious practice from emotions and the psychological positioning of that. So that's, I think, where we would qualify sub as well.
There's another aspect, which is that I think that as Firas said, Saba Mahmood makes absolutely, wonderful leaps forward in thinking about the nature of piety. And we really draw on her work and have learned from it. One of the things that her subjects, so Saba Mahmood is an anthropologist, or was an anthropologist, studying modern conservative Muslim women's mosque movements, the mosque movement in Egypt specifically, right? And she had picked up on and noticed that there's these hugely widespread women's movements in the mosque, and that actually there are women who are teaching other women. And one of the things that happens in these women's movements is that they tend to see things in a very gendered way. So they'll take the example of the girl who approaches Moses in the Qur'an, and she approaches him bashfully, and she'll say, and they'll potentially, apply this to how, women should behave modestly, or, and we completely agree that in the Qur'an, women should behave modestly equally. However, in the Qur'an, men should behave modestly. And that's actually not a gendered thing. The Prophet himself is described in very similar terms about being bashful or embarrassed. And he's embarrassed in certain social situations, and God comes in and says, I'm not embarrassed, to lay down the law. And so there's a little bit of a subtle difference there. I don't know if that's what you were getting at, or if Riyad, or if you wanted to qualify that.
I mean, it sounds to me actually like there's more of a point of agreement between what you're saying and what Saba Mahmood is saying, because her focus on the body, as I understand it, is intended to collapse that difference that you were talking about a moment ago, Firas, that this dualistic attitude about there is a piety of the body, and then there is this piety of the mind. I think that in a way, and if I understand your argument correctly, there is this harmony between the psyche and the action of the body, and piety sort of emerges at the intersection of that harmony. And in an admittedly different way, I think Saba Mahmood is arguing the same thing. I mean, she sets out, for example, in her major book on this, Politics of Piety, to respond to that assumption that we carry about this dualistic or binary difference between the body as a site of action and the psyche as a site of belief.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that one of the wonderful things that she does is she really draws on Bourdieu and the idea of a habitus, and this idea that you cultivate the proper attitudes of mind, then you enact them in the body, and then that process increases piety. And I think that we would really, really agree with that perspective on piety for sure. And that, yeah.
I think also, just to kind of defend our position a little bit more, probably more perhaps I failed initially to say something more than Mahmoud, but I think the issue is actually a larger issue with how you understand social theory in our times, which is that, the whole debate about agency and structures and all of the nuances and qualifications that were made later by philosophers very recently all end up kind of, ending up being about something to do with free will. It's as this question is what happens to freedom and free will. Even if you call it structuration, as Giddens probably did, it's you were talking about structures. So what happens to free will? And what if free will is all about the pursuit of self-interest? If that's what you mean by it, well, that's not very great. And I think what we're trying to say is that there's a much more powerful sense of freedom in the Quran, free will to pursue piety, that I didn't think was probably as powerfully expressed in works on the politics of piety, because I felt the aspects of structures and group effect and tend to eclipse that. And there's a really powerful sense of personal freedom in the Quran and the pursuit of piety on that basis. So that's what I really wanted to say.
So one point that comes out in the book that you make is that there's no radical readjustment of social structures in the Quran. However, there is a radical recalibration of the meaning attached to these structures and how they're enacted. My question is, what happens when these meanings entail necessary alterations to the structures and institutions themselves? So, for example, if we look at, let's say, the question of ownership of slaves, that's an institution that's not done away with, but the meaning of, not only the meaning, but even the institution itself is kind of transformed when you can't do anything you want with your slave. Likewise, there's obviously narrations where the pagans take umbrage at the idea or the notion that you have to treat an animal with respect or dignity or kindness. And of course, you can extend that to obviously, again, let's say the head of the household, their responsibility towards women and children in the household and things like this. At what stage do all of these, transformed meanings actually transform the institution itself and therefore transform the social structure?
Well, thank you so much for this question. I think that it's interesting because exactly as you point out, I think that there are different levels or layers in what's going on in the Quran. There's certainly a recognition that these social structures are there, but I guess Muslim scholars over time have all recognized that there are different layers in the Quran, right? And I would take that further. I believe Firas would as well, but to consider, say, the type of person that's being addressed, right? So there is we actually extended our argument on the nature of kind of commands and laws in the Quran after writing this book. And one of the things that we noticed is that some commands in the Quran are actually simply there to prevent a worse harm, right? So that's what you could say about maintaining the social structures. The social structures are there, and there are many kind of commands about those social structures that's to prevent even more serious harm from happening. But to take the example of slavery, which is an excellent example, of course, it's a moral good then to free a slave, or to even better, to give the slave money so that they can actually get married and form their own household, right? And so then you have to think about, what does it mean to have a command in the Quran, and how is that attached to morality? So we're used to thinking about law as something in a secular world. Law is something that you break and that you can, that it describes levels of badness, right? Stealing a loaf of bread to feed your kids versus killing someone. There are levels of badness in the law. In Quranic commands, it's very different because there are many levels of goodness and more good that you can do, right? And so here's where you get to the potential undermining of those social structures themselves. Because if what's most important is the piety of a person, and if people are treated as absolute equals in terms of their piety and their pious agency, then why then did in later Muslim fiqh, why were those social structures reified as kind of institutions of inequality and institutions in which one person alone held all the power? And I think that this is a great question to ask, because I think that it becomes very, very clear in the Qur'an that there are many more levels of good that can be done, and that many of those commands to husbands about their wives are really for very bad people. I look at the polygamy command, I think, what kind of a person needs to be told not to use all the money of the wards who are in their care, and not to take advantage of them potentially in other ways, and instead to marry them and give them a dowry if they're thinking about in those lines? What kind of moral trajectory is that person on if he needs to be told something like that? So you think, well, then that gets to the different levels of people that the Quran might be addressing.
And I think if you, I mean, part of, as we say, I think part of the method is that, you need to keep reading the text to really get its points. And over time, you build up a picture, or you build up a very strong sense of the imperative in the Quran. And if you look at all the crucial moments in which there are attempts to, impose limitations on violence or injustice and so on, there's always a sense in which a verse comes up and says, but you can do better. Like, take the retaliation verse, for example. That's that tribal thing we know, that, well, a thing in retaliation for another, right? If you kill somebody from one tribe, they have the right to kill somebody from your tribe, and it's kind of graded and so on. But there's always a sense, and the following verse says, but also in such situations, there's a possibility of life. In other words, you can do better. There's always a qualification that, okay, this is how you guys think, try to be just, but you can always do better. And in the sense that you can always do better is also actually kind of juxtaposed to God. God's always doing better than us in the Quran. Like, whenever we sin, we err, God forgives, right? God pardons. God is merciful. So he's always better. So that becomes, and don't forget, God's the patron, so we have to kind of be like the patron, right? We can be better. We can be better at every moment. So, and your question about the institutions and whether you can change them, I think it's quite clearly the case that if you can do better, you should do better. And if things are better now as a consensus for human society, then the Quran would be applauding it. We don't need to ask the Quran whether we can have X or Y or Z institution. If it's more just and if it's better for all, it's fine. And I think what's so radical is that this attempt was already being shown in the 7th century, not now that we have, our methods of kind of, we're so enlightened in some sense, right, that we now can think of just institutions and write about them in political theory and so on. But I think the Quran was already thinking of a better condition.
I think we just have one more question, and it's a fairly straightforward one, but I think one that many, especially aspiring young scholars, might be interested in. What's it like to co-author a book or collaborate on a project together? And how do you pass that? Like, who does what, and so on?
Oh my God, that's a whole book in itself. It's it's not all in your hands, I think. It's not all on, we don't control that. I think we just were on, we're along a ride. We went along a ride, and it was stormy, it was tempestuous. There were sometimes, very, very beautiful and kind of enlightening, and we'd get excited about new ideas, and it kind of wrote itself to some extent. I guess that's what all people who enjoyed their writing a book have always said. It kind of wrote itself. I think that division of labor there was a practical aspect to it as well. We'd share drafts overnight. Karen did a lot of she's kind of good at one thing, I'm good at another. I think these were complementary. And so we kind of used our respective skills to just get the best possible thing out. But Karen, I'm sure you have much less, I don't know. Do you have good memories of the
I mean, it was great. It was amazing. It was what happened is that it was because it was about ideas. And the thing is we didn't really think of it as a book. We were going to write an article or a chapter in our other book. We weren't even going to I actually started out with all the preconceptions that someone would have if they really were steeped in the field of Quranic studies and not steeped as much in the Quran itself. And Firas didn't have those because he had a lot more familiarity with the Quran. And we somehow came together and were able to really question each other's assumptions in really basic ways. And I was able, if Firas would make a contention, say about the equal moral agency and the importance of that, the importance of the afterlife, that was something Firas said from the very beginning. And yet to express it the way that we did in the book, which I hope is comprehensible, we really went through a lot because I didn't take that. I didn't believe him at first, or it wasn't something that we really that we were on the same page about, and as being of that level of importance. And so that was something that took a huge amount of discussion, and we developed methods for reading the text. And I mean, it really came about as well at a particular time and place because somehow in lockdown, life stopped in a certain way and it became incredibly stressful. And we only had certain number of hours to work, but Firas's meetings, a lot of them were canceled. He's got an administrative job. And so on a practical level, we had time where we could meet and yet it was hugely intensely pressurized. And so there was somehow this moment where there was a kind of explosion that occurred and resulted in a book. And it was great though. I think that there was a real sense in which, we'd both been taught by the late Patricia Crona, and in the beginning, we kept saying, "What would she think of us talking together in this way?" Because we seemed to be coming from such completely different perspectives, but we ended up actually being completely aligned on a perspective, and then actually furthering work that she herself started on the idea of patronage. She worked on patronage, but skipped to the Quran. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also it's worth saying, admitting, confessing, I suppose, that we're like accidental scholars in some sense. I mean, I think we come from literary and kind of, that world of literature and art, and we love that just as much as we love studying I don't know, a text in a very scholastic sense. And so I think we brought the reading of the text and our appreciation of the text to that. I think we didn't want to say, I think we always discussed, is this a book for, Muslims only or for everybody? Is it an apologetic work? No, it's actually just reading a text on its own grounds. I mean, it's trusting that that a text, and it's not just any text, but even if it were any text, that a text has a message. And if you read it right, you can get that message. And whether you like it or not, that's a separate question. But I think we coincided in that. And ultimately, I think a lot of the sections began to kind of write themselves. Well, Karen did a lot of the writing, but
You can say it wrote itself. Easy for you to say. To say.
Yeah. Well, that's the complementary aspect, because I think I have a different approach to how to explain things. I'm not so good, perhaps, as she is. She kind of pursues a much more clear method. But I think they were complementary because we'd get complexity and simplicity at the same time.
And I think that also you can't discount the value of, I think at that point it was 25 years of daily reading of the Quran, which you had undertaken, Firas. There's actually a huge value in that for scholarly approaches to the Quran, simply being the familiarity. You remember buhtan? There's this term and it only appears a few times, and you said, one time when we were looking at it in one place, I think it was in Surah An-Nur, you were like, but that very word is used to describe Mary elsewhere. And, you were really able to make those sorts of connections that now, yeah, I mean, I'm able to do that a lot better now.
We're going to have to leave it there. Karen, Feras, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Riyadh.
And to our listeners, we do hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Send us an email at proteanview@muftah.org. We'd love to hear from you. Whether you're tuning in on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, We'd really appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of the show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org and navigate to the Protean View tab to see all our episodes. And follow us on our socials using the handle at Protean View, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.